What is up, everybody? James Hancock here, back to review the latest episode of Legion, Chapter 11. But before I dive into the latest episode, I just wanted to respond to a few comments from last week. A few people noticed some inconsistencies when it comes to my pronunciation of Amal Farouk versus Amul Farak. This is a problem that I've often noticed when I'm discussing characters that I first encountered as a very small child when I was barely able to read. And it's one of those things where you recognize the character's name in a comic book panel, but you never actually say the name out loud. So if I occasionally say Farak instead of Farouk, it's just weird leftovers from my childhood bubbling to the surface of my brain. But I also saw a couple comments last week that I absolutely loved, where people were predicting that this horrible, destructive menace that has wreaked havoc in the future very well might turn out to be David himself. I feel like the best ideas are always obvious in hindsight, but that didn't occur to me at all until somebody pointed out. But if that turns out to be the case, A, those commenters are much more perceptive than I, but B, that would be a very cool story twist. One last note, as I was waiting for this episode to come out, I was feeling the itch for more David Haller stories, so I decided to go all the way back to the original stories where he first appeared in Marvel Comics, and while he technically appears at the very end of New Mutants number 25, it's really New Mutants 26, 27, and 28 from the year 1985, where we get the first great Legion story. And while stylistically, Chris Claremont's writing and Bill Sienkiewicz's art really have nothing to do with the creative direction that Noah Hawley has decided to use on this show, it was still really cool just seeing how on the first page of New Mutants 26, it almost reminded me of one of those classic Legion opening title shots that we see. And I'll be talking more on that front as I get into this episode, because this episode's title sequence was particularly good. In any case, if you're an old school X-Men fan, and I most certainly am, but if you're tired of rereading the same classic X-Men stories from the 70s and 80s written by Chris Claremont, I strongly encourage people to check out his run on New Mutants, especially when Bill Sienkiewicz was doing the art. It's completely deranged and avant-garde for the time. Almost so much so that it kind of scared and disturbed me as a little kid, and I kind of avoided New Mutants for a little while. But if you want to see the original interpretation of this character, David Haller, this is the place to go. As much as I love and adore what Noah Hawley has been doing with this show, I think it's always important to remember where these characters come from. Even if these characters come from the very heavily regulated and self-censored era of the Comic Book Code Authority. But let's dive into Chapter 11. So many cool things were at play in this episode. I love how the episode opened with one of those short vignettes narrated by John Hamm. These little essays are rapidly becoming my favorite part of the show, but he discusses the phenomenon known as a nocebo effect as opposed to a placebo effect. And the phenomenon deals with the negative physical symptoms one might feel from the powers of suggestion, which leads into conversion disorder, which is a key ingredient in the plot that we see later in the episode. We basically see this great little short film where all these cheerleaders in a small town start to display a nervous tick in their shoulder, and it rapidly starts to spread and basically take over the town. The gist of this little short is how much of our reality that we perceive might just be disorder. But what's absolutely amazing about it is that the camera pulls back and we see all these separate characters, and we see the title card of Legion between all these various characters suffering from this nervous tick. Much like the show Legion, it was absolutely gorgeous, but also highly disturbing all at once. And from there, the episode slips into a really interesting flashback where we see Farouk engaging in psychic combat. He appears just to be having a meal, but we can see in his glasses little flashbacks from the chalkboard psychic combat sequence that we saw in season 1. But when his head drops to the table, his body is picked up and swept away, and it is taken off to this Mego Monk temple where it's buried down in the foundations of the building. And from there, the rest of the episode pretty much unfolds almost like a horror movie in some ways, or more almost like a haunted house story. It has a lot more mystery and dread and kind of puzzle solving as opposed to outright horror. But all hell is breaking loose at Division 3 because this Mego Monk has broken out of the chatter room, and pretty much everywhere he goes, he's spreading the chattering disease. As David learns in a little psychic conversation with the Shadow King had absolutely nothing to do with this little chattering disease that's been spreading around the world. It 100% comes from the Mego Monk. We also get a nice little scene with Aubrey Plaza looking stunning in her bathing suit as Lenny basically begging and pleading with David to find a way to get her out of Farouk's mind. If I have a criticism of this episode, it would be that we see precious little of Aubrey Plaza. Lenny's one of the key ingredients of the show, but sadly she's only in it for a very brief moment, and we get none of Oliver. But I can forgive them because we do get some interesting lore where the Shadow King describes to David how a villain is a very subjective term, and from his point of view that he was actually a benevolent ruler, and that his people flourished while he was in charge. and that it was actually David's father who was the villain who came in and upset the natural order of things. Lenny is bored to tears by this conversation, and we get this great little bit where she puts a gun to her head, but because she's in the Shadow King's mind, when she pulls the trigger, we just get these little bubbles that come out. Taken by itself, it's a pretty insignificant little moment, but it's just one of many little cool stylistic details that when you add them all together, it's what makes Legion the most interesting show on television stylistically. But when David emerges from his conversation with the Shadow King, he basically has to go through Division 3, encountering all of his friends and allies one person at a time, and they're all under the spell of the chattering disease, and he has to go into their minds in order to free them, and each mind creates a different riddle or problem they have to overcome in order to free them. And what I loved about all these little puzzles and riddles is that David Haller is an insanely powerful mutant, and both in comics and in film and television, whenever you're dealing with a really powerful character, it's incredibly difficult to come up with interesting challenges consistently that actually provide a decent challenge. It's a problem that many people have faced with the character of Superman, since he can basically fly and smash and blast his way through pretty much anything that's in front of him. But when dealing with trying to heal a sick mind, David Haller can't just nuke his way through it with all this psychic power. He has to operate more like a surgeon and kind of unlock things. And that's really smart on Noah Hawley's part, because in season 1, David Haller's main weakness was that he had the Shadow King in his mind. If you're going to have a really powerful character, but you have yet another powerful character lurking inside of his mind, that's a classic weakness to kind of handicap him. I think it's important for the show only to really let David Haller cut loose on a very rare occasion so that it feels special when David finally has an opportunity to do so. So inside Ptolemy's mind, they basically find a maze garden where he lives totally in the moment. But David pulls a little ET and bops him in the head with a glowing finger, and he emerges. Melanie's mind is almost like an old-fashioned early 80s RPG. I mean, RPGs in the early 80s could be pretty rudimentary, pretty basic, with no graphics, just written lines and puzzles. And inside this RPG, there's this horrible, deformed, crippled Minotaur. But all the while David is freeing his friends, he's also getting these psychic messages from the Sid of the future, and she's sending them one letter at a time. And I was a little worried because I didn't write those letters down, and I was worried that the episode would draw to a close with mine having no idea what she was talking about. Luckily, they finally do show us that she's just writing hurry. But by far my favorite part of the episode has to be when David finds himself in the shoes of a Mego Monk, watching as the temple becomes totally unraveled due to the fact that the Shadow King's body is down in the catacombs beneath it. We see that the Shadow King's body is basically in this white smooth coffin, and that he's hammering at it from within repeatedly. And as he does so, we see that the monks up above are starting to weep and laugh uncontrollably, or that they're committing suicide, and we see the origins of that little chattering disease. It was just really creepy, eerie, beautiful stuff. I absolutely loved it. But we finally reach the climax of the episode when we see that Fukuyama has been totally laid low by the monk, and the monk's actually got himself attached to Fukuyama in a way so he can communicate. And Melanie and Ptonomy are having a debate with him about the dangers of the Shadow King being reunited with his body, and they keep discussing this mysterious weapon that is the only thing that can be used against the Shadow King, and as it turns out, that weapon turns out to be David himself. But when the monk threatens to bust David for basically having a secret agenda with the Shadow King, David takes him up to the roof for a little one-on-one conversation, but rather than disclose the location of the Shadow King's body, the monk just decides to fall to his death. Luckily, this is the location of Sid, who is still under the spell of the chattering disease. David goes inside into basically a blizzard. And we see in the preview for the next episode that the gist of chapter 12 is going to be David and Sid trying to navigate the maze of her mind. So all around, another quality episode. As a storyteller, Noah Hawley continues to bat 1,000. And I was doing some research on any news related to Noah Hawley, but I was unable to find any news related to a possible season 3 of Legion. I saw some rumors that he was talking about doing a Doctor Doom show at one point. However, that was all before the announcement that Marvel was acquiring Fox. However, I know that Disney is going to be announcing their own Disney-branded streaming platform in the future. And if all these characters like Doctor Doom that were previously at Fox are now at Marvel, if Noah Hawley wanted to do a Doctor Doom show, but give it the completely deranged Noah Hawley signature, nothing can make me happier. However, at this point, I think we would just have to wait and see for any additional information about what the future might hold for Noah Hawley. So thank you for everybody out there who's been making some predictions in the comments on my previous videos. Definitely keep those predictions coming. Seems like the community surrounding Legion is an absolutely outstanding community of film and comic book and television lovers. Obviously, superheroes are very much mainstream entertainment these days, but if a lot of those shows and movies are a little bit reminiscent of drinking cheap beer, I feel like Legion very much is the champagne of superhero television shows right now. So thank you so much for watching my video. I really appreciate it. Please consider giving my channel a subscribe. Give me a shout on Twitter @Colbrax if you want to talk more, or leave me a comment in the comments below. And I'll be back at y'all tomorrow night to review the latest episode of The Expanse. Talk to y'all soon.